Tamriel. For thousands of years, it was home to mighty empires, legendary wars, and unforgettable heroes and conquerors. Back when Tamriel was still under the control of the Elven races, humans, who lived as their slaves, started the Alessian Slave Rebellion, which led to the founding of the first great human empire. The origins of this empire go all the way back to the moment Queen Alessia received the Dragonfires and the Amulet of Kings from Akatosh. With this amulet, Alessia banished the Daedra from Mundus, the mortal realm, bringing safety and stability to the continent. This first empire lasted for over 2,000 years. After the Alessian Empire, known as the First Empire, came the Second Empire, which spanned from the end of the First Era into the middle of the Second Era. During this period, we see the rise of the Reman dynasty. After repelling the Akaviri invasion, this dynasty reunited a large part of Tamriel, which had been divided into small kingdoms, and founded the Reman Empire. At its peak, this great empire managed to control nearly all of Tamriel except Morrowind for a time. Eventually, this empire would make way for the greatest conqueror Tamriel had ever seen, and the empire he would build. It was the late Second Era, and the Second Empire had collapsed, plunging Tamriel into a time known as the Interregnum, a period of chaos and power vacuum. Except for Morrowind, which was kept stable under the rule of the Tribunal, the rest of the continent was falling apart. And it was during this era of chaos that a general named Hjalti Earlybeard emerged. He began the journey of founding what would become the Third Empire, an empire with a power like Tamriel had never seen before. Yes, you guessed it right. This man would later be known as Titus Septim, the first to conquer all of Tamriel and eventually ascend to godhood as Talos himself. After a series of key events, Titus Septim claimed the imperial throne and founded the Septim dynasty, which ruled all of Tamriel for 433 years. Many different Septim emperors came and went after Tiber, but the final two emperors left Elder Scrolls fans with some of the most emotional and nostalgic memories: Uriel Septim VII and his illegitimate son Martin, the last of the Septim emperors, who we'll also talk about in this video. The written history of Tamriel as we know it begins in the first year of the First Era, when King Aplir united the wild and supposedly ungovernable Bosmer people and founded the Cameron dynasty. Anything before that is usually referred to as ancient times. Since then, three major human empires have risen on the continent, shaping the lives of all Tamrielic peoples. In fact, it's fair to say that the course of history has always revolved around these empires. In the very first Elder Scrolls game Arena, we try to rescue Emperor Uriel Septim VII, ruler of the Septim Empire at the time, from the Plane of Oblivion. We also try to stop Jagar Tharn, a powerful sorcerer who secretly rules the Empire while disguised as Uriel himself. So, right from the beginning, our main motivation in the story has always been to protect and preserve the Septim Empire. In the second game of the series, Daggerfall, it's once again Emperor Uriel Septim Mede II, the same one we saved from Oblivion in the first game, who sends us off to the lands of High Rock. And through the actions we take in this game, all of Tamriel ends up united once more under the banner of the Septim Empire. Once again, the fate of the Empire and the fate of us, the player, become intertwined. Then comes the third game, Morrowind, which holds a special place in the hearts of many of us. Here too, our journey begins thanks to a small favor from the Emperor. Our main goal is to fulfill the prophecies surrounding Indoril Nerevar and defeat Dagoth-Ur. Dagoth-Ur, meanwhile, is trying to drive out the Imperial Legion from Morrowind, seeing them as invaders on his homeland. That's exactly why Emperor Uriel Septim VII supports the player, because he believes we might be the reincarnation of Nerevar himself. By the end of the story, Dagoth-Ur is defeated, and the Empire gains indirect control over Morrowind. Once again, it's thanks to us that the Empire strengthens its authority. What an empire! The fourth game, Oblivion, might just be the one where we form the deepest emotional bond with Uriel Septim VII. It's also the game where we witness the end of the Septim dynasty, and with it, the death of Uriel Septim, someone we've been connected to in one way or another throughout the Elder Scrolls series. Sadly, this time around, we can't save him. But our mission becomes about protecting the legacy he leaves behind. That's when we meet Martin Septim, a name that ends up written in the history books in letters as bold as Tiber Septim's. Then, in the fifth game, Skyrim, the story shifts to the Mede dynasty, which carries on the legacy of the Septim Empire. For the first time in the series, we as players are given the full choice to either support or oppose the Empire. Will you save it or bring it to its knees? That decision is entirely up to you. But by now, one thing is clear. In Elder Scrolls games and lore, the human empire has always been at the very center. Yeah, I know, I've been talking a lot, but I had to give at least a quick overview of Imperial history, because the main topic of this video is the fate of the Empire itself. Is the empire we know still standing? What kind of empire did Uriel and Martin Septim sacrifice themselves for? Is Titus Mede II truly a rightful ruler? And after the events of Skyrim, is the empire on its way to salvation, or has it become a rotting institution? In this video, we'll explore the empire's recent condition, its rulers, and some possible futures it might face. Hopefully, by sharing my own thoughts too, I can offer you a fresh perspective. Before we jump into the video, I just want to say thank you all for the amazing support you've given this channel. It's because of you that I'm able to keep creating more content about the Elder Scrolls universe. So if you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps. And of course, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the topics we cover, so feel free to drop a comment below. Enjoy the video. The Last Septim Emperors. In this video, I'm not planning to go into a full detailed history of the empire or cover every single imperial dynasty. Instead, our focus will be on the state of the empire during the time period we reach in Skyrim. And from there, we'll try to explore some ideas and possibilities about its future. But to do that properly, I think we first need to take a look at the final days of the Septim dynasty, the one that founded the Third Empire. Because in my opinion, the decline and corruption of the empire really began with the death of Uriel Septim. So that's where we'll start, by talking about Uriel Septim VII and his heir Martin Septim. As I mentioned earlier, the Third Empire was founded by Titus Septim at the beginning of the Third Era. In fact, the founding of the empire also marked the start of a brand new era. The Septim dynasty ruled the empire for over 400 years, but after the Oblivion Crisis, the Septim line came to an end, and power shifted to the Mede dynasty. So if we're looking at the empire we see in Skyrim, we can understand it as being ruled by the last known emperor of the Mede line, Titus II. The biggest difference between the empire under the Mede dynasty and the one founded by Titus Septim is that it no longer rules over all of Tamriel, and we'll get into the reasons behind that later in the video. Uriel Septim VII. So why is Uriel Septim VII such an important emperor, and what does he represent for all of Tamriel? Just to clarify before we move on, when I say Uriel in the rest of the video, I'll be referring to Uriel Septim VII. As I mentioned earlier, Uriel was the emperor in every Elder Scrolls game leading up to Skyrim, which already makes him a significant figure for fans of the series. He ruled Tamriel for a full 65 years, 10 of those spent imprisoned in Oblivion. But even during those dark times, he never gave up or lost himself. He always stood strong, trying to keep the Septim Empire alive and striving for a peaceful vision of Tamriel. Honestly, you could say Uriel Septim had one of the most unfortunate fates among all the emperors. Few others in Tamriel's history have endured what he did during his long reign. Even the greatest crisis in Tamrielic history, the Oblivion Crisis, broke out near the very end of his life. Uriel was only 22 years old when he took the throne. During the reign of his father, Pelagius Septim VI, Tamriel had already made serious progress toward cultural unification. Uriel vowed to continue that mission. His biggest goal was to turn Tamriel into a fully functioning confederation, one united not just by borders, but by shared culture and identity. That was a major challenge because while Titus Septim had managed to unite the provinces under one banner, his reign didn't last long enough to truly unify them culturally. Over the following 400 years, there were still provinces, like Morrowind and Black Marsh, that had little to no connection to imperial culture. The leaders of Morrowind still didn't care much for imperial rule. The deeper parts of Black Marsh remained a mystery to the empire. In the Somerset Isles, there were small-scale anti-imperial boycotts, and in High Rock, the various Breton kingdoms often fought among themselves. This was the political landscape Uriel inherited when he took the throne, and he had a lot of work ahead of him. In the early years of his reign, Uriel focused heavily on Morrowind and Black Marsh. In both regions, imperial authority was severely limited, as the local populations resisted assimilation. The Dunmer and Argonians were deeply rooted in their own traditions and culture. In response, Uriel launched an aggressive campaign of cultural expansion in these areas. When we look at what's been said about Uriel, we learn that he was known for his sharp mind. He had a remarkable talent for diplomacy, one of his strongest traits. He knew exactly when to use the threat of force and when to hold it back. He was also described as bold and incredibly self-confident. Thanks to these qualities, Uriel was able to achieve many of his goals not through massive battles, but through diplomacy, building relationships and minimizing bloodshed wherever possible. This diplomatic skill stayed with him throughout his life and earned him several key victories, which we'll talk more about later in the video. But now, it's time to look at a major turning point in his life. In the early years of his reign, Uriel's greatest supporter and closest advisor was the Imperial Battle Mage, Jagar Tharn. Because of his position, Tharn not only advised the Emperor but also served as the head of the Elder Council, giving him a lot of power. After gaining Uriel's trust, Tharn betrayed him. Using a powerful artifact he had stolen years earlier, the Staff of Chaos, he trapped Uriel in the Realm of Oblivion. Then, using illusion magic, Tharn took on Uriel's appearance and secretly ruled the Empire for 10 full years. The only real threat to Tharn's plan was Uriel himself, so Tharn broke the Staff of Chaos into 8 pieces and scattered them across Tamriel to make sure the Emperor would never return. I talked more about Uriel's rescue in my previous video about the Oblivion Crisis. The first game in the series Arena tells the story of how we, the player, search for the pieces of the staff and ultimately rescue Uriel Septim. So I won't go into those details again here. If you're curious, feel free to check out that earlier video. What matters now is this: it was us, the player, who saved Uriel. That's where our story first connects with his. Uriel later said that he remembered almost nothing about his time in Oblivion, aside from the endless nightmares that haunted both his waking hours and his dreams. He believed the whole experience felt like a dream and had no idea how much time had passed. What we do know is that he suffered for the rest of his life from terrible visions, dreams that showed him glimpses of his own assassination and even the beginning of the Oblivion Crisis. These prophetic dreams brought him constant pain. And if I can add a quick side note here, I think this kind of prophetic burden can sometimes feel more like a curse than a gift. A perfect example of this can be seen in the famous sci-fi series Dune, through the character of Paul Muad'Dib Atreides. If you're familiar with that story, you'll understand the kind of torment Uriel Septim VII must have gone through after returning from Oblivion, constantly haunted by visions of the future. When Uriel was rescued by the Eternal Champion and returned to the Imperial throne, he found a Tamriel on the brink of collapse, nearly torn apart by Jagar Tharn's reckless rule. But Uriel was strong, young, and full of ambition. Another man might have been broken by a decade in Oblivion, but Uriel came out of it with new traits: patience, seriousness, and an even stronger sense of duty. At the time, powerful local rulers in both the East and West were rising up, demanding sovereignty. But this time, instead of using aggression, Uriel chose a more calm and strategic path. He began operating in secret, using agents from the Blades to carry out covert missions all across Tamriel. Surprisingly, this approach worked better than expected. In Morrowind, where Uriel wanted to strengthen Imperial culture and authority, he chose to align with House Hlalu. After positioning House Hlalu as the local guardians of Imperial values and economic growth, Imperial influence began to spread, and the region's economy started to flourish. Uriel even stationed Imperial legions at the court of King Hlalu Helseth, reinforcing the house and making space for the Empire's authority to grow. But his most impactful move came from his interest in the Nerevarine prophecy. As we saw in the game Morrowind, he sent an agent of unknown origin to the province, someone who fit the prophecy. Uriel hoped that by supporting this agent, the prophecy would come true and weaken the Tribunal Temple's authority. And that's exactly what happened. The Tribunal fell, and the Imperial cult began to rise as the dominant faith in the region. In the years that followed, Vvardenfell was opened up for settlement by the King of Morrowind. With Imperial support, House Hlalu expanded into parts of Vvardenfell and grew more powerful. As House Hlalu became a dominant political force in Morrowind, Imperial authority naturally grew alongside it. A large part of Morrowind now openly accepted Imperial law, its legions, and its bureaucracy. Meanwhile, in the west, Uriel turned his attention to High Rock, where, as you may remember from Daggerfall, several kingdoms were fighting each other to become the dominant power. Once again, through a hero he personally sent, Uriel managed to ease the tension and bring the region under Imperial control. So, in Uriel's second reign, much like his fathers before him, Tamriel entered a period of peace and prosperity. The Empire recovered from the damage caused by Jagar Tharn, and things started to feel stable again. For what might have been the last time, all of Tamriel stood united under the Septim banner. The death of Uriel Septim VII has always been one of the most heartbreaking moments in the Elder Scrolls series for me. Losing a character we've crossed paths with in nearly every game, right before our eyes, hit hard, and I'm sure other longtime fans felt the same. Speaking personally, I could never fully warm up to the Empire as we see it in Skyrim, but I truly believe that if the Empire had continued under Uriel Septim VII and later Martin Septim, it would have been a different story. Maybe in such a timeline, the Skyrim Civil War would have never happened at all. As the events I'm about to talk about will show, Uriel was the kind of ruler who was fully willing to sacrifice himself for the unity and prosperity of the Empire. That's why he stands out as one of the most special characters in the entire series. Now, let's talk about the Oblivion Crisis and Uriel's death. The fourth game in the series, Oblivion, begins in the year 3rd Era 433. Tamriel is still ruled by Uriel Septim VII. At the very start of the game, we witness the final hours of his reign. All 3 of Uriel's known sons have been assassinated by the Mythic Dawn cult. As a result, the Blades believe his life is in danger and begin escorting him to a safe location. They use a secret escape route hidden inside a prison cell, which just so happens to be where we, the player, are locked up. As he passes by us, Uriel says the now iconic line,
"You, I've seen you. Let me see your face. You are the one from my dreams. Then the stars were right. And this is the day. Gods give me strength."
These words are actually drawn from one of the prophetic dreams he's had. But I like to think it's also Bethesda's subtle way of nodding to the bond players already share with Uriel from previous games. Uriel knew full well the danger looming over Tamriel, and he was also completely aware of his own approaching death. When we follow him through the secret passage and ask, "Where are we going?" he responds with,
"I go to my grave. A tongue shriller than all the music calls me. You shall follow me yet for a while. Then we must part."
That line feels like a poetic acceptance of his fate, driven by the visions that had haunted him all his life. Not long after, Uriel Septim VII is assassinated by a cultist, and we watch him die right in front of us. It's the end of an era in the Elder Scrolls universe, both tragic and unforgettable. His 65-year reign comes to an end at the age of 87. With Uriel's death and the extinguishing of the Dragonfires, the barrier between Tamriel and Oblivion collapses, allowing Daedric armies to begin their invasion. This moment also marks the end of the peaceful era Uriel had spent his entire life fighting for, following in his father's footsteps. From here on, the fate of the Empire begins to shift dramatically, leading to the tensions that eventually explode in Skyrim. Martin Septim. Maybe if the Oblivion Crisis hadn't happened almost 200 years before Skyrim, we'd hear Martin Septim's name and the sacrifice he made a lot more often. Or maybe, when people hear how Tamriel was saved, they just assume it's nonsense or some kind of legend, and that's why they believe it was Akatosh alone who saved the world, not Martin. It's hard to say for sure, but I do believe Martin Septim doesn't get the recognition he deserves in Skyrim. When Oblivion Remastered came out, I replayed the story and was reminded of just how good of a person Martin was, how he adapted to every situation, how brave he was in the face of disaster, and yet how underappreciated his efforts were. To be honest, I originally started making this video as a kind of tribute to Martin. It later evolved into a broader analysis of the Empire, but still, he was the starting point. Anyway, let's get back to the main topic. Uriel Septim VII had 3 legitimate sons, but his wife, Queen Alessia, was known to be proud, ambitious, and greedy. Over time, Uriel became deeply unhappy in the marriage and came to regret it. That led him to have a few illegitimate affairs, resulting in 2 more sons. One of them was Martin Septim, who would later briefly become emperor. Martin wasn't raised by Uriel and had no idea he was a Septim or heir to the throne until the Oblivion Crisis began. Still, Uriel always kept tabs on him through his close friend Joffrey. Growing up, Martin believed his father was a farmer and that his mother had died giving birth to him. Later in life, he got drawn into the seductive world of Daedric magic. He even joined a cult dedicated to Sanguine, the Daedric prince of debauchery. But after a tragic accident that cost the lives of his friends, and thanks to the words of a priest who helped him see the light, Martin turned away from that path. He became a priest of the 9 Divines, serving in the chapel of Akatosh in Kvatch. And that's where he was living right up until the moment he met the hero of Kvatch. Before he's assassinated by the Mythic Dawn cult, Uriel Septim VII gives the Amulet of Kings to the hero of Kvatch and tells them to find his last remaining son, Martin, the last of the Septim line. Thanks to that information, the hero tracks Martin down in the city of Kvatch. But by that point, the Oblivion Crisis has already begun and an Oblivion Gate has opened right outside the city. The destruction has officially spread across Tamriel. In this video, I won't go too deep into the overall details of the Oblivion Crisis. Instead, I'll focus on the critical moments where Martin played a key role. If you're not familiar with the crisis itself, I recommend checking out my previous video, How Did the Oblivion Crisis Change Tamriel? Now, let's continue. Once Martin is found and told he's the son of Uriel Septim, he immediately understands what's at stake and doesn't hesitate to step up. From the very beginning, he's committed to ending the Oblivion Crisis. For most of the crisis, he's kept safe at the Blades' headquarters, Cloud Ruler Temple. But even on the way there, he and the hero of Kvatch are ambushed multiple times. Martin never backs down, he stands his ground and protects himself and those around him. When Martin finally arrives at Cloud Ruler Temple and is received with all the respect due to a ruler, he still doesn't see himself as an emperor. His only goal is to stop the crisis and save Tamriel. He has no interest in power or the throne. Everything he does is motivated by the desire to protect life in Tamriel. One of the things I really appreciate about Oblivion is how it shows Martin's gradual transformation, from an ordinary priest to a true leader. And it's not just spelled out for the player, it's something you feel, step by step, through how the people around him begin to treat him differently. Throughout the game, Martin often questions whether he's truly fit to rule. At times, he even turns to us for advice, but as the story goes on, through battles and hard decisions made side by side with the hero of Kvatch, he begins to grow into the role. By the final stages of the game, Martin doesn't hesitate for even a moment to face Mehrunes Dagon himself, showing the kind of courage that would have made his ancestor Titus Septim proud. I'd say Martin had a naturally brave personality and wasn't afraid to take big risks. One of the best examples of this, and also one of the hardest decisions he ever had to make during his journey, was the defense of Bruma. This event is set into motion when the Mythic Dawn successfully uses the Amulet of Kings. In order for Martin to get the amulet back, he needs to open a portal to Mankar Camoran's paradise. But to do that, he needs 4 key items, and by this point, the hero of Kvatch has already retrieved 3 of them. The final item is a Great Sigil Stone, and the only way to obtain one is to allow a Great Oblivion Gate to open, then destroy it. But for a Great Gate to appear, 3 smaller Oblivion Gates must first open. That means unleashing Daedric armies and the massive siege crawlers that flatten entire cities. Right around the time Martin realizes all this, word arrives that the city of Bruma, near Cloud Ruler Temple, is under attack by the Mythic Dawn. The cult plans to open gates there and bring in Daedric forces to destroy the city. Martin knows that if he wants to get the Great Sigil Stone, he has to allow these gates to open, but doing so could easily mean the destruction of Bruma and the death of its people. Martin chooses to take the risk. Wearing the legendary armor of Titus Septim himself, he rallies his soldiers and personally leads the defense, standing at the very front lines. He knowingly allows the gates to open, but fights tooth and nail to protect Bruma, inspiring those around him with his courage. Thanks to the time he buys, the hero of Kvatch manages to close the gates and secure the Great Sigil Stone. After the battle, Martin earns the respect and admiration of the troops who fought beside him, and many begin to see him as the true emperor. Up until the defense of Bruma, Martin had never set foot on a battlefield. But this moment proves not only his intelligence and discipline, but his unmatched bravery as well. The armies defending Bruma included soldiers from various noble houses across Cyrodiil. After witnessing Martin's bravery, their praise becomes one of the strongest legitimizing forces behind his claim to the imperial throne. With the Sigil Stone secured, Martin uses it to open a portal to Mankar Camoran's paradise. The hero of Kvatch steps through, defeats Camoran, and retrieves the Amulet of Kings. Meanwhile, Martin sends a soldier to the Imperial City to present his claim to the Elder Council. Now, all that's left is for him to ascend the throne and end the Oblivion Crisis. Just as Martin Septim arrived at the Imperial Palace, about to be officially crowned emperor by Chancellor Akatosh, a massive Daedric invasion broke out in the very heart of Cyrodiil. Oblivion gates started opening all over the city. But this wasn't like the other invasions we'd seen across Cyrodiil. This time, Mehrunes Dagon himself had stepped into the mortal realm. He had entered Tamriel in person, with one clear goal: to kill Martin Septim and make sure no one with Septim blood would ever sit on the throne again. For the people of Tamriel, that moment was the very definition of hopelessness. It felt like everything was lost. The fear and despair were overwhelming. But Martin Septim wasn't like everyone else, and everything he'd been through in this story had shaped him into someone capable of making the kind of decision no ordinary ruler could. Martin made the ultimate sacrifice. He faced Mehrunes Dagon alone. Using the Amulet of Kings, he merged his soul with the avatar of Akatosh, the dragon god of time, and transformed into a blazing dragon wreathed in divine fire. In a truly epic battle, the avatar of Akatosh, now embodied by Martin, destroyed Mehrunes Dagon's physical form and banished him back to Oblivion. But this divine act came at a cost. The experience consumed the very essence of Martin's soul. The dragon let out one final roar, then turned to stone, becoming an eternal statue in the temple, immortalized for all time. And just like that, Martin Septim passed from the world of the living. Afterward, Chancellor Akatosh declared that Martin would be remembered as the last and greatest of the Septims, and that, had he lived, there was no doubt he would have become a truly great emperor. With no other living heirs of Septim blood, his death also marked the end of the Septim dynasty. But thanks to Martin's sacrifice, the barrier between Oblivion and Tamriel was sealed forever. His death also brought an end to the Third Era, an era that had begun with Titus Septim's conquest of all Tamriel. And so, we clearly see how the last two Septim Emperors were able to sacrifice themselves so easily for Tamriel, viewing it not as a collection of territories, but as a whole worth protecting at any cost, even their own lives. When the Septim Empire came to an end with the Third Era, its authority was still respected across many of Tamriel's provinces. And maybe that's because its rulers ruled with compassion, strong will, and a kind of steel-hard resolve that came through in their sacrifices. Why am I bringing this up? Because by the time we reach the events of Skyrim, the Empire, now ruled by the Mede dynasty, is in the middle of a deep crisis. We witness a full-blown civil war between the Empire and the Nord rebels, known as the Stormcloaks. In fact, we're even asked to pick a side in that war, and depending on what we choose, we essentially decide the outcome, whether the Empire survives or falls. But when making that decision, it's important to ask ourselves, what kind of empire are we really fighting for? Is it the kind of empire where the ruler would give their life for the people, like during the time of Uriel and Martin Septim? Or is it now an empire that exists mostly to protect the interests of a ruling class, one that might sacrifice its people to preserve its own power? That's the real question. If I'm being honest, I think I'd be more willing to preserve the unity of Tamriel as the Dragonborn if the Empire were still led by rulers like the last two Septims. I believe Martin Septim would have had the strength and the humility to stand up to the Thalmor without letting pride or ambition cloud his judgment. But Martin sacrificed himself. He became part of history. And now we're left with an empire ruled by a new dynasty and a new threat looming over it, the Thalmor. Transitional period of the Empire. After the Oblivion Crisis, Chancellor Akatosh, and Altmer himself, reluctantly assumed power as a regent. He tried to carry on the vision left behind by Uriel Septim VII, a united Tamriel built on peace and prosperity. One of his biggest efforts toward this goal was to ensure that the Altmer of the Somerset Isles willingly remained part of the Empire and became a stable, cooperative province. But that was easier said than done. As I explained in detail in my previous videos, in the aftermath of the Oblivion Crisis, the Thalmor began claiming credit for the sudden disappearance of the Daedric forces from the Somerset Isles. Most of the Altmer population didn't know about Martin Septim's sacrifice, and there weren't many people outside the Thalmor offering an alternative explanation, so the Altmer believed them. However, there were a few Altmer opposition voices who recognized this lie and saw the Thalmor's claim of heroism for what it really was: propaganda. These elves understood the dangerous potential of the Thalmor's rise. Chancellor Akatosh reached out to those Altmer dissidents in an attempt to build stronger ties between the Empire and the Elven homeland. His goal was to support the creation of a pro-imperial political authority within Somerset itself. But the Thalmor saw this plan coming, and they acted quickly. In Cyrodiil, the heart of the Empire, Chancellor Akatosh was assassinated by Thalmor agents. His death triggered a power struggle among several powerful noble families in Cyrodiil, all vying for the throne. This 7-year period of chaos came to be known as the Stormcrown Interregnum. The House of Mede rises. Titus Mede, a Colovian born in Cyrodiil, saw the weakness of the temporary rulers and the crumbling state of the Empire during the 7-year Stormcrown Interregnum. Recognizing the opportunity, he began plotting to overthrow the current leadership and take control of the throne. The Empire had grown so weak that Titus was able to capture the imperial city with fewer than 1,000 men and declare himself the new emperor. But before he could even settle on the throne, another warlord named Eddar Olin launched an attack on the capital, also claiming the right to rule. Despite having only a small army and a weakened imperial legion, Titus Mede was a skilled commander and successfully repelled the assault. At first, both the people and the Elder Council saw Titus as nothing more than a usurper. But thanks to the efforts of his close friend Hiram, Titus slowly transformed from a power grabber to a savior in the eyes of the public. Over time, the people of Cyrodiil came to accept him as their rightful emperor. As the new ruler, Titus quickly realized just how vulnerable the empire had become, both militarily and politically. One of the biggest blows came from the Somerset Isles. In a swift and brutal coup, the Thalmor overthrew the Altmer king and queen and seized power. They then renamed the region Alinor, a name that referenced a time when elves ruled over Tamriel, symbolizing the return of elven dominance in the long-standing struggle between elves and men. Even before taking power, the Thalmor had been promoting a strict and radical ideology based on elven supremacy and anti-imperial sentiment. But Titus Mede likely didn't grasp just how dangerous that would become. Not long after, the Thalmor annexed Valenwood and formed the Aldmeri Dominion. Then, for the next 70 years, they politically isolated themselves from the rest of Tamriel, cutting all ties with the Empire. Maybe this is why Titus chose to focus more on the western and northern human kingdoms, seeing them as more stable allies or easier conquests. Or perhaps he believed his army couldn't stand up to Alinor in a direct confrontation and aimed to expand the Empire's borders first to strengthen his forces. Whatever his reasoning, one thing is certain: the time he allowed the Thalmor to spend in isolation would later come back to haunt his successor, Titus Mede II. We know that during the reign of Titus Mede I, he made efforts to bring Skyrim, High Rock, and Hammerfell under Imperial control. While he wasn't able to take direct action against the Elven uprising in the Somerset Isles, he was largely successful in the western and northern parts of Tamriel. In Hammerfell, there was a Redguard general named Takar, who was actively fighting against the Empire. Instead of crushing him through force, Titus chose to confront the general personally. He managed to win him over through a direct, face-to-face relationship. In the years that followed, General Takar became one of the Emperor's most trusted military commanders. After this turning point, Hammerfell officially joined the Empire. Next came High Rock and the Seven Holds of Skyrim, which also fell under Imperial authority. Titus described his achievement by saying, "And with just a few rivets, I pieced the Empire back together." But of course, it was clear to everyone that the Empire was nowhere near the legendary heights it had reached during the Septim era. Interestingly, there's very little information about how or when Titus Mede I died. What we do know is that he had a single heir, Atrebus Mede. After Titus's death, Atrebus ascended to the throne. Details about Atrebus's reign are incredibly scarce. However, it's said that he tried to form an alliance with the Argonians against the Thalmor. During Titus the Worm's rule, the Thalmor were described as silent enemies. It seems that under Atrebus there was an attempt to take early action against that silent threat. But judging by what happened later, those efforts didn't amount to much. The most concrete and detailed information we have about the Mede dynasty comes from the reign of its final and most well-known ruler, Titus Mede II. Titus Mede II might just be one of the unluckiest emperors in Tamriel's history. Since there's very little known about his life before taking the throne, I'll be focusing only on the events that took place after he became emperor. And just as a side note, I find it a bit strange how little information there is about the entire Mede dynasty. I couldn't find a clear reason for this, but if any of you watching have details I may have missed, feel free to share them in the comments. Now, back to what I was saying. Titus II's misfortune. Just 3 years after taking the throne, he found himself in the middle of one of the largest wars Tamriel had ever seen. The Great War. The conflict erupted before he had a chance to fully establish his authority, and it rapidly sped up the Empire's decline, something his predecessors had tried so hard to prevent. It also forced Titus II to make some incredibly difficult choices. Some of the viewers on my channel have described him as the right man at the wrong time. And honestly, I really like that description. You can pretty much divide Titus's time as emperor into two distinct phases, before and after the Great War. In the beginning, he came off as bold and aggressive, but later that attitude shifted into one of caution and restraint. There's no denying that some of his hesitant and flawed decisions played a part in weakening the Empire. But before judging him too harshly, I think it's important to understand the reasons behind those decisions. So let's take a quick look at the situation Titus II inherited when he took power. Black Marsh had declared independence after the Oblivion Crisis, when the military faction known as the An-Zileel came to power. Morrowind, after suffering the devastation of the Red Year and fueled by rising anti-imperial sentiment, also left the Empire sometime before 4th Era 48. The Thalmor had already pulled off coups in both Valenwood and elsewhere, bringing them into the fold of the Aldmeri Dominion and becoming a major force on the continent. Hammerfell was still technically part of the Empire, but it was plagued by internal conflict between two major factions. The Empire couldn't manage to resolve the tension or bring peace to the region. So by the time Titus Mede II took the throne, the once great empire was left with just 3 stable provinces still fully loyal to it: Skyrim, High Rock, and Cyrodiil. And if you're familiar with the story of Skyrim, I'm willing to bet that sentence just put a little knowing smile on your face. Titus II's first major trial, the Great War. Titus II had just 3 years to stabilize his rule before his leadership was put to the test. The growing threat from the south, the Aldmeri Dominion, became impossible to ignore as the Empire's weakness became more and more apparent. In the 3rd year of his reign, Thalmor representatives arrived in the Imperial City. During this high-stakes meeting, they delivered an ultimatum to Emperor Titus II. The terms were extreme: a tribute to be paid to Alinor, the complete disbanding of the Blades, a ban on the worship of Talos across all Imperial territory, and the surrender of most of southern Hammerfell to the Dominion. Yes, the Empire was weak, but these demands crossed a serious line. Accepting them would have only delayed the inevitable collapse and given the Thalmor more leverage to destroy the Empire later. Many Imperial generals warned Titus II to accept the terms, arguing that the Legion wasn't strong enough to go to war. The military had been stretched thin by years of crushing rebellions, and the remaining forces were scattered across the provinces. But Titus II ignored their warnings and made a bold decision. He rejected the ultimatum. In response, the Thalmor dumped a pile of severed heads, Blades agents, at the Emperor's feet. Given the power the Dominion had reached at that point, it's likely the Thalmor expected and even wanted their demands to be rejected. And once they had their answer, they declared war on the entire Empire. The Great War had begun. Within days, Dominion armies launched simultaneous invasions into Hammerfell and Cyrodiil. One army, led by the skilled Thalmor general Lord Narifin, invaded Cyrodiil from the south, capturing city after city on their way to the Imperial City. By 4th Era 172, the Dominion army was positioned at the walls of the capital. In 4th Era 173, reinforcements from Skyrim arrived and joined the Imperial forces. Still, the Dominion army crossed the Niben and surrounded the Imperial City on 3 sides. The only open road left was the one leading north to Bruma. In 4th Era 174, the Dominion launched a massive assault. Imperial generals urged Titus II to remain in the city and help defend it. But once again, the Emperor ignored their advice. He withdrew from the capital with the main army, leaving the 8th Legion behind to hold the city. It was a desperate fight. The Imperial City fell. The palace was burned to the ground, and the people were slaughtered in a brutal massacre. This horrific event hardened public opinion across Tamriel, fueling widespread hatred toward the Thalmor in the years that followed. At this point, it might seem like Titus II hadn't made a single good decision. Maybe he should have listened to his generals from the start. Maybe he should have stayed and defended the capital. But what happens next might just challenge that judgment. Titus II retreated north towards Skyrim, where he met up with reinforcements led by General Jonah. This Nordic army dramatically strengthened the Imperial forces. The Thalmor believed the war was all but won after the Emperor fled the capital. Confident in their position, they began negotiations with Titus II, and that's when he made his move. He pretended to accept their surrender terms, but in truth, he was just buying time to regroup and rebuild his army. The Forgotten Hero's legacy and an epic attributed to Titus II. Now, at this point in the story, we hit a major question mark. After regrouping his army, the Emperor laid siege to the Imperial City and took it back in a massive battle known as the Battle of the Red Ring. During that battle, the entire Thalmor force stationed in the city was wiped out. This victory ultimately brought an end to the Great War through a negotiated peace, and most of the credit for this strategic masterpiece is given to Titus II. But is that really the whole story? Let's take a closer look. Once his forces were ready outside the city, Titus II divided the army into 3 groups and surrounded the Imperial City from 3 different directions. According to official accounts, he personally commanded the northern force, which was positioned to launch the main attack. In 4th Era 175, the Battle of the Red Ring began. Some say that during the battle, Titus II personally wielded the legendary sword Goldbrand and captured Lord Narifin himself. With their commander taken down, the Dominion's forces collapsed and were completely destroyed. The Imperial City was back in the hands of the Mede Empire, and Titus II's name became tied to a tale of military heroism. But here's the thing. There's no official Imperial record confirming that he actually wielded Goldbrand. In fact, some rumors go even further, claiming that Titus II didn't lead the army at all. This version of events comes from an alternative story told by the Moth Priest Kellen. According to him, Titus II had grown increasingly frustrated because the Thalmor seemed to be anticipating every move the Legion made. That's when the Forgotten Hero, a figure many of you might recognize from the Elder Scrolls legends, entered the picture. The Forgotten Hero and their allies discovered that Lord Narifin was using a prophecy orb that allowed him to foresee every major event before it happened. Even worse, he was planning to sacrifice the citizens of the Imperial City in order to summon a Daedric army. When the Forgotten Hero shared this with the Emperor, he was horrified. He tasked them with infiltrating the city and destroying the orb. They succeeded, but by the time they returned to camp, the Emperor had been wounded in an assassination attempt and was unable to lead the army himself. So he handed over his armor to the Forgotten Hero, ordering them to command the troops in his place and to act as if they were the Emperor. So according to this version of the story, it was actually the Forgotten Hero, disguised as Titus II, who led the Legion during the Battle of the Red Ring. If this claim is true, and the person wearing the Emperor's armor during the battle was actually the forgotten hero, then what can we really say about Titus II, the man who receives all the credit? Some argue that even if he wasn't on the battlefield, it was still Titus II who designed the strategy and laid out the plans for the battle. In that case, the forgotten hero was simply following those orders and carrying them out to victory. Others believe that the real credit belongs entirely to the forgotten hero, and that Titus II built his post-war authority on a convenient lie. As for me, I tend to side with those who support the decisions Titus II made up to this point. Why? Because I don't believe there was ever a version of peace with the Aldmeri Dominion that wouldn't have worked against the Empire's interests. You can't negotiate with the Thalmor while protecting your people and your sovereignty at the same time. That's just not how they operate. And as we'll soon see, what happens next only reinforces that idea. White Gold Concordat. The Battle of the Red Ring ended and the Imperial City was retaken. The occupying Thalmor army inside the city was wiped out. But the Imperial Legion was too weak to continue fighting. More than half of the Legion's battle-ready soldiers had been lost. 3 entire legions had been completely destroyed. Faced with this grim reality, Titus II realized that there wouldn't be a better moment to negotiate peace. So he sat down at the table with the Thalmor to discuss a ceasefire. The Dominion returned to the negotiations with the same brutal demands from their original ultimatum: the banning of Talos worship, the surrender of southern Hammerfell, and tribute to be paid to Alinor. Titus II believed that peace, even under harsh terms, would buy the Empire the time it needed to recover. So he signed the treaty. Despite how severe the conditions were, most of the Empire welcomed the peace. In Skyrim, the Jarls were given chests full of gold by the Empire to secure their signatures on what would become known as the White Gold Concordat. In my opinion, this means the Jarls of Skyrim essentially sold out their people's religious freedom and sovereignty in exchange for those gold-filled coffers. But hey, maybe your take is different. Hammerfell, on the other hand, outright rejected the treaty. Naturally, the Red Guards had no intention of handing their lands over to the Thalmor. But Titus II couldn't risk breaking the agreement, so he officially removed Hammerfell from the Empire, abandoning it to stand on its own. To me, that was the biggest mistake Titus II ever made, because what happened next is incredibly important. Hammerfell fought back. They launched a full-scale war against the Dominion that lasted 5 brutal years. And when it was over, the Red Guards had driven the Thalmor out of their territory and forced them into a peace treaty. The Dominion fully withdrew from Hammerfell and turned its attention elsewhere, namely to Skyrim. After this war, Hammerfell emerged as an independent kingdom with its own internal stability. And according to many critics, myself included, this proved that signing the White Gold Concordat was unnecessary. If the Red Guards could defeat the Dominion on their own, imagine what could have happened if Titus II had stood firm and pushed back alongside them with a united empire. But instead, by signing the treaty, Titus II backed the Empire into a corner. Now, if you've played Skyrim, you're probably already familiar with what happened next, so I won't go into too much detail here. After the Concordat was signed, the Empire didn't immediately enforce the Talos ban. But when a Nord Jarl named Ulfric Stormcloak led his forces to retake the city of Markarth from the Forsworn and demanded the restoration of Talos worship in return for handing the city back to the Empire, things escalated. The Thalmor viewed this as a violation of the treaty and pressured the Empire to act. Still weakened from the war, Titus II gave in. Harsh measures were introduced. Thalmor justiciars were allowed to enter Imperial territory, especially Skyrim, to monitor enforcement of the Concordat's terms. An arrest warrant was even issued for Ulfric Stormcloak. The enforcement of the Talos ban sparked outrage, especially in Skyrim, where Talos worship was strongest. Many Nords began to believe that Emperor Titus II had not only abandoned humanity, but also his honor. As a result, Ulfric Stormcloak, Jarl of Windhelm, rebelled. He killed High King Torrig and launched a civil war to make Skyrim independent from the Empire. The Empire responded by sending General Tullius to deal with the uprising. And so, the civil war between the Imperial Legion and the Stormcloak rebels began. So, what do you think? When we look at the outcomes in Hammerfell and Skyrim, do you believe Titus II's actions after the Great War were truly in the Empire's best interest? What we do know is that, by the end of Skyrim, Titus II can be assassinated, either by the Dark Brotherhood or by us, the Dragonborn. So by the time the Elder Scrolls 6 takes place, Titus II will likely be dead. But what happens to the Empire afterward? That's something we still can't predict. As for the Skyrim Civil War, the Dragonborn has the power to support either side, and depending on that choice, determines who comes out on top. Since branching endings have been a part of the Elder Scrolls series all the way back to Daggerfall, we can safely say we won't truly know the consequences until the Elder Scrolls 6 is finally released. Does the Empire deserve a good ending? I've laid out all the necessary information up to this point, and now I want to ask you this. Is the Mede dynasty truly carrying on the legacy of the Septim bloodline, or has that legacy already been lost to the dusty pages of history? Can we still talk about a unified Tamriel under the rule of the Medes? Or is the idea of unity in Tamriel now just a fantasy? We know there are a significant number of dissenting voices among the elves who oppose the Thalmor. Maybe in the Elder Scrolls 6, that internal opposition will be used against them. Maybe it'll even be one of the reasons the Thalmor fall. Or maybe the Thalmor won't fall at all. Maybe they'll conquer all of Tamriel and usher in a new age of Elven rule, though personally I see that as unlikely. To me, it seems far more probable that Tamriel will enter another age of chaos and endless war. A second Great War feels more realistic than any Elven Golden Age. The real question is, what kind of force will rise to challenge the Thalmor? When we look at independent regions like Hammerfell and Black Marsh, we see that they've actually had more success under their own leadership than they did under the Mede dynasty. That might lead us to believe that Skyrim's independence could also bring positive results. But then again, there's Morrowind, a province left to fend for itself after the Empire withdrew. It's struggling, its lands are under constant threat of invasion. Maybe we'll learn more about what's going on there in the next game. As for me, I personally believe the Empire under the Mede dynasty is a far cry from the ideals of the Septim rulers. Neither Titus I nor Titus II are leaders who, in my view, would be willing to truly sacrifice themselves for the unity of Tamriel the way Uriel VII or Martin Septim did. Uriel and Martin didn't rule for the sake of the Septim banner, they acted for the people of the Empire. Of course they had their own political interests, but when faced with a critical choice, they put the safety and future of every citizen above their own legacy. Martin didn't hesitate when he stepped in front of Mehrunes Dagon. He knew it would mean the end of the Septim bloodline. But he did it anyway, abandoning Hammerfell overnight, ignoring the traditions of the people of Skyrim and banning Talos worship, leaving Morrowind alone in the face of the Red Year disaster and the Argonian invasion. All of these are signs that the Mede Empire has very little influence or mobility outside of its central province, Cyrodiil. And honestly, when you look at these examples through the eyes of a Stormcloak rebel, how can you blame them for rising up? Of course, there's also a large portion of people who believe the Empire, meaning Titus II, was in the right. They argue that the decisions made in Skyrim and Hammerfell were all part of a larger plan to buy time, to gather strength for the inevitable Second War with the Dominion. General Tullius in Skyrim even hints at the idea that Emperor Titus II is preparing for another massive war, a war he believes is unavoidable. He also thinks the Skyrim Civil War itself is part of a Thalmor plot, designed to divide the Empire and Skyrim, weakening both in the process. And honestly, he's not wrong. When we look at Thalmor intelligence reports, we see clear confirmation that they've been secretly supporting Ulfric and the Stormcloaks behind the scenes. They want the Civil War to last as long as possible, to keep both sides distracted and exhausted. In response to my video, Why the Stormcloaks Should Win, many viewers argued that Ulfric is a traitor working for the Thalmor, and that an independent Skyrim would spell the end for both itself and the Empire. And to be fair, those arguments shouldn't be dismissed outright. But then we have the example of Hammerfell, a province left to fend for itself, with no help from the Imperial Legion, that still managed to resist and defeat the Thalmor. Maybe Skyrim can't stand alone, but what if it didn't have to? Couldn't it form an alliance with provinces like Hammerfell, Morrowind, or High Rock to build a unified front against the Dominion? In this video, I wanted to show you, through my own perspective, how the Empire under the Medes and the Empire under the Septims were driven by entirely different motivations. In some of my earlier videos, I talked about why I hesitate to support the Empire in Skyrim, and here I aim to break that down by comparing the personalities and leadership styles of the two dynasties. You're more than welcome to share your own thoughts in the comments. Let's open up the discussion and explore new points of view together. Before I wrap things up, there's one more possibility I want to briefly touch on, something I didn't dive into earlier but could have major implications. As you know, in Skyrim, we play as the Dragonborn and directly influence the outcome of the Civil War. We can even go so far as to assassinate Emperor Titus Mede II. That's a huge event, something that could affect the fate of all Tamriel. But which of these events will be considered canon in the Elder Scrolls 6? We just don't know. However, it's very possible that the last Dragonborn will appear in the next game as a major political figure, maybe even as the Emperor, or as the new High King of Skyrim. Then again, like the Forgotten Hero, maybe they'll just vanish without a trace. We can't say for sure. But whatever direction the story takes, the Dragonborn could end up being the key to a Tamriel we never expected. These are questions we'll have to wait to answer in The Elder Scrolls 6. And let's be honest, there's a good chance we'll be spinning theories for at least another 5 years. But let's not forget, Tamriel is a land shaped by gods, heroes, and demons. It's endured chaos, countless wars, and endless power struggles. And the people who live there have never stopped fighting. They never will. And because of that, we'll keep getting new stories. Stories we'll gladly lose ourselves in for hours, even days. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe. I'm incredibly grateful for all the support you've shown this channel. It's because of you that I find the motivation to keep creating content about the Elder Scrolls universe, a world I've loved since childhood and still feel deeply connected to. See you in the next video.